So my name is Catherine Connolly, and I am the Automated Decision Research Manager with Stop Killer Robots. Stop Killer Robots, as you've already heard, is a global coalition of more than 240 civil society and non-governmental organisations from all around the world, working for new international law on autonomy in weapon systems and for meaningful human control over the use of force. The Automated Decision Research Team is the monitoring and research team of Stop Killer Robots. So myself, together with my colleagues Gugu and Sai. Gugu is based in South Africa, Sai is based in India, and I'm in Ireland. We monitor state support for negotiation of new legal rules on autonomy in weapon systems, and we produce research and analysis on autonomy in weapon systems and automated decision-making in wider society and the political and social context and repercussions of those kind of technologies. So before I get into autonomous weapon systems, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of mundane and more day-to-day algorithmic processing and the kind of technologies that we encounter ourselves, because, as you know, each and every one of us is increasingly subject to automated decision-making, to biometric systems, and to algorithmic processing. On my way here yesterday through Dublin Airport, I noticed that I was processed by systems with facial recognition capabilities at least twice, once just at a shop in the airport where the tills have facial recognition cameras on them, and then of course at passport control, and then again yesterday entering Helsinki through the electronic passport gates. I'm sure when my boarding pass was scanned and my passport was scanned at the boarding gate as well, biometric data in my passport was checked, and thankfully, I didn't trigger any security alerts or anything, so I'm able to be here today. And it's likely, of course, that I was subject to more of this kind of processing on my way here and in the time that I've spent here in Helsinki so far. And it happens to all of us, and we don't tend to think about it unless something goes wrong. So most of us don't have a problem with using the electronic passport barriers at airports. Most of us don't have a problem with being subjected to automated decisions by our governments or our banks or our healthcare providers until it goes wrong. And when it does go wrong, we expect that we're going to have an avenue for complaint, that the wrong can be remedied, that there's someone to complain to, and that somebody can be held accountable, and that there are rules and regulations about what kind of automated processing we can be subjected to. I don't want it to end up sounding here like I'm advocating for us to, turn the internet off, basically, and shut down all digital systems, and not at all. What I am advocating for is for us to be aware that we are entering an era of increasing digital dehumanization, both in our daily lives, in the civil sphere, and in the context of armed conflict and warfare. So what is digital dehumanization? Digital dehumanization is the process where humans are reduced to data, which is then used to make decisions or take actions that negatively affect their lives. And automated harm occurs when these decisions, taken by automated decision-making processes or by machine learning systems, by algorithmic processing, negatively impact us. And this process deprives us of our dignity. It demeans individuals' humanity by removing or replacing human involvement or responsibility through the use of automated decision-making in technology. Now, as I've said, the digitization of information about people and the use of automated decision-making technologies based on such digitized information isn't always problematic. There are a lot of good things that we can get from such systems as well, but it does carry with it an increased risk of being dehumanizing, of course, and of causing automated harm. And these risks of digital dehumanization and the need for significant oversight and legal regulation of algorithmic and automated decision-making systems, and of ensuring that human rights are respected when you and your data is processed, is widely acknowledged. It's one of the primary reasons that the Council of Europe are creating the AI Convention, and it's why the EU is in the final stages of negotiating its Artificial Intelligence Act. And there are a range of different harms at different levels of severity that can result across various uses of automated decision-making technology. So, for example, using algorithms to decide what grades are awarded to students can lead to unfair and potentially biased outcomes, as happened in England and Wales during the pandemic. The use of such technologies for banking based on personal data, such as where you live, coupled with your age, your race, your gender, can result in an automated system denying you a loan or a mortgage and access to finance. When algorithms and automated decision-making technologies are used for the administration of social welfare, you could be wrongfully denied benefits or erroneously flagged for fraud, as has already happened in the Netherlands, Australia, the United States, and more countries. In the areas of policing and criminal justice, the use of automated decision-making based on facial recognition technology can lead to wrongful arrest and incarceration, as can the use of predictive policing and criminal sentencing technologies, as we have seen already occur all over the world, from the United States to Argentina to Abu Dhabi. In all of the cases above in this slide and the previous slide, harms occurred to people on the other end of those automated systems. Students didn't get the right grades. They weren't awarded the grades they should have in the UK and England and Wales. Students who lived in poorer areas or were from minority backgrounds were much more likely to be given lower grades by the algorithm, even if they, in all of their other school exams, had actually done better in the exams than students from wealthier backgrounds. So then some of those students didn't get their places at university courses. Financial systems and automated systems denying somebody access to finance based on something like where they live or their race has happened already in the US. UK regulators issued a warning about it last year to banks as well. People with disabilities have had their hours of home care cut in the US. In the Netherlands, an algorithm that falsely accused people of welfare fraud affected tens of thousands of families. Over 1,000 children were taken into foster care. People lost their homes. An accounting system in the UK, you can see it on this slide here at the bottom. An automated accounting system in the UK wrongfully flagged 700 postmasters working in the postal service for fraud. Many of them were convicted and jailed. And then, of course, incorrect facial recognition matches have also jailed people, taken people away from their lives and their families, and left innocent people having to pay legal fees and bail for something they had absolutely no involvement with. So what does this have to do with autonomy in weapons systems? Well, autonomous weapons also process data, and it sorts the data, takes in information through sensors and processes it. And the potential automated harm arising from autonomous weapons includes injury or death. As such, the digital dehumanization that is caused by an autonomous weapon is at the severe end of the scale of harms caused by automated decision-making or algorithmic processing technologies. And what are we talking about exactly when we talk about autonomous weapon systems? So some, very fantastical science fiction type things might come to mind. We're actually talking about those systems that are much more mundane than something like the Terminator or a RoboCop type system. Autonomous weapon systems are simply systems that detect and apply force based on the processing of data from sensor inputs. And in these systems, once they're activated, there's a period of time when the weapon system can apply force to a target without additional human approval. So with autonomous systems, the specific object to be attacked and the exact time and place of the attack are determined by sensor processing instead of by an immediate human command. So that means that the human operator isn't determining specifically where, when, or against what force is applied. And the kind of information that an autonomous weapon system uses to select and engage a target will depend on the type of sensors that a system uses, what information those different types of sensors collect. So autonomous weapons use the information then that they take in from their sensors. That could be something like an image processing sensor, so a camera, with an image processing software. It could be a heat sensor, an acoustic sensor, a weight sensor, for example. And it uses the information that it takes in from these sensors and fits that information against a generalized target profile. And if the information that the system gets from the sensors doesn't fit its target profile, then the system shouldn't use force. But if the information that the system gets from those sensors matches the pre-programmed target profile, then the weapon system will use force against that target. That target could be a person, could be a car, for example, depending on the target profile that the system uses. So what this means then, again, is that an algorithm makes that decision or triggers that use of force and engages the target based on the data taken in by the sensors, instead of a human, such as a soldier, making that decision. And as the International Committee for the Red Cross has pointed out, this also means that it is, say in this case using the human car example, the vehicle or the victim that triggers the strike, not the user. So they're also an example of a victim or target activated weapon system. And when a system is activated, we don't know specifically who or what it will strike, nor precisely where or when that strike will occur. So autonomous weapon systems are qualitatively different from other types of weapon systems. Autonomous weapon systems don't see us as human beings. Instead, we're sensed by the machine as a collection of data points, and the machine uses its algorithm to fit these data points against its target profile. The digital dehumanization then that results from reducing people to data points based on specific characteristics also raises serious questions about how target profiles are created and what pre-existing data those target profiles are based on. And it also raises questions about how the user can understand what falls into a weapon's target profile and why the weapon system decided to use force. Another aspect then of the digital dehumanization that we see with autonomous weapon systems is the distancing of human judgment and control from decisions about who or what to use force against and how and when to use it. So that means that people are further removed from targeting decisions and further removed from the consequences of using force. They also make it harder to understand who is responsible for uses of force that do not comply with the rules of international humanitarian law, the body of law that applies in armed conflict, or with international human rights law. And understanding and applying these legal rules requires a sophisticated and nuanced understanding of the context in which the use of force is taking place. Autonomous weapons do not have the capacity to exercise human judgment over the kinds of complex scenarios that play out during war or in domestic policing or border control scenarios, for example. And they also don't have the ability to exercise doubt or to question themselves as humans do. So they really are an example of digital dehumanization at its most extreme. Giving machines the power to trigger life or death decisions undermines human dignity, and instead of being seen as people, people are processed as objects. So I'm just going to take a sip of water, then I'm going to continue. We're already seeing systems with various autonomous functions being used in conflict, and improved autonomous capabilities are being incorporated all the time. There are already systems whose manufacturers claim to be able to distinguish between civilian and combatant. This is a screen grab from a system created by the weapons manufacturer Elbit Systems. This is the Lanius system. It's a loitering munition type system that can also swarm. And they claim that the system can distinguish between combatant and civilian, or friendly and hostile forces. On what basis, we don't know. Trained on what data, we don't know. So again, these are questions you have to ask when we claim that a system can do such things, and what data were these systems trained on, who labelled that data, where did the data come from, and what sets these friendly and hostile forces apart. Can you be sure that your system knows the difference between a rifle or like a walking stick, for example? Can you be sure that your system can distinguish between a military vehicle and an ambulance? Those are all questions we have to ask when we see states use these kind of systems. So what do we want then from Stop Killer Robots? We want a new international legal instrument that combines a mixture of prohibitions and obligations. So that instrument should prohibit systems used and designed to target humans. It should prohibit systems that cannot be used with meaningful human control. And it should ensure that all other systems must be used with meaningful human control. So a mixture of prohibitions and rules. This isn't just what Stop Killer Robots is calling for. This is also what the International Committee of the Red Cross is calling for. And the International Committee of the Red Cross does not issue calls for new international rules very often. This is not something they do frequently. The UN Secretary General has also called for states to conclude new international rules by 2026. So he called for that in his new Agenda for Peace document published in July. That's an unprecedented timeline for action. So I say that we want meaningful human control, and then people say, well, what does meaningful human control mean, and how do we make human control meaningful? So there are three key building blocks that help to maintain human control and that make that control significant or meaningful. And states in international discussions broadly now agree on the need for these three different things. And these are predictability, understandability, and temporal and geographic limitations on use. And it's by creating rules in terms of these operationalizable technical concepts of predictability, understandability, and restrictions on geographic area of use and temporal time of use, that an overarching requirement for human control, as I said, can be made meaningful or sufficient and can be formalized and codified. So these building blocks are obviously interconnected. For a system to be predictable implies that the user of the system is able to sufficiently predict the behavior of that system in a given context of use. In order to adequately predict the behavior of a system, the user should be able to sufficiently understand how the system functions, and they must sufficiently understand the contextual features that the system will encounter in a specific instance of use. So temporal and geographic limitations are therefore required in order to render those contextual evaluations possible. And obviously, it's not in the interest of any defence force to use a system that is unpredictable, that is not understandable, and that they don't know the actual operational context of the system. And what about the prohibition then on systems designed or used to target humans? So the ICRC has stated in their position on autonomous weapons that use of autonomous weapon systems to target human beings should be ruled out. This would best be achieved through a prohibition on systems that are designed or used to apply force against persons. And again, that's because autonomous weapon systems are qualitatively different, as I've said, to other weapon systems, because if such systems are used against people, that entails individuals being sensed, processed, and targeted as patterns of data and objects by machines. So what can we do, or what is being done about algorithmic processing and automated decision making, both in our, the civilian context and also in the military context? So at EU level, as I've said, the European Parliament is in the final stages with the other EU bodies of negotiating the Artificial Intelligence Act. There are a number of civil society organisations who work specifically on this issue. The European Centre for Not-for-Profit Law, European Digital Rights, for example, all have information on those areas of negotiation for those who are interested. I recently co-wrote a blog with Francesca Finucci, who's Senior Legal Advisor with the European Centre for Not-for-Profit Law, and she's involved in negotiations at the Council of Europe level as a civil society representative there, and the AI Act. That's on the Stop Killer Robots website for those who are interested. At the international level, slow down, I can see someone telling me, sorry, thank you. At the international level, what Finland can do is vote for the resolution on autonomous weapons. That's going to be presented at the upcoming UN General Assembly starting on Monday. So the UN General Assembly First Committee on Disarmament session, the 78th session, will start on Monday. And at the end of the month, between the 30th of October and the 3rd of November, states are going to have the chance to actually vote on that resolution. Last year at the UN General Assembly, there was a joint statement of more than 70 countries who joined that statement. Finland was one of them. That was the first joint statement on autonomous weapons. But this will be the first opportunity for states to actually vote for a resolution. And what that resolution will do, will have the SecGen, the Secretary General of the UN, commission a high-level report into autonomy and weapon systems, taking into account views from all states, not just the states that are currently engaged in discussions under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons at the UN in Geneva, where talks have been going on for about 10 years now. There are currently 100 states that support the negotiation of new rules. Finland is not one of them yet. Finland are currently in our undecided list. We have a state positions monitor with the positions of 144 states. It's publicly accessible there, and you can see what Finland have said about their position. As I said, we now have 100 countries supporting those negotiations. We expect that we'll be adding more states to the yes list following the General Assembly. A number of NATO states support the negotiation of new legal rules, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, for example. So just before I finish up, so we can move on to the panel discussion and the Q&A, I think questions we should ask ourselves when we think about these weapon systems are who benefits from building these systems? Who are these systems most expedient for? Whose hands? Who will have this technology and what's going to be done with this technology? And are these tools that we even want to be building in the first place? Our humanity and our complex identities shouldn't be reduced simply to physical features or patterns of behaviour to be analysed and pattern matched by systems that are unable to understand concepts of life, human rights or liberty. And we should not be delegating life and death decisions and actions to machines. Thank you very much for your attention.
Please, I would love you to tell us who you are, a bit of your background maybe, and then your perspective on the issue that was just presented by Dr. Connolly.
Yes, of course. First of all, it's really, really nice to be here today. My name is Laura Kankala. I work as Threat Intelligence Lead at F-Secure. What that means is that I focus on threats, cybersecurity-related threats that affect all of us when we are online. And of course, these sort of threats that come with machine learning, with AI, with this extensive data collection on us is of course one of the very key central pieces of the things that of course troubles us as well, and we're trying to find solutions to that. Perhaps a little bit on my background before I share some thoughts on this excellent presentation. It was really insightful. I've actually worked quite extensively as a cybersecurity consultant, mainly doing offensive security, so breaking into systems, breaking into computers, finding vulnerabilities, finding issues in the systems that can be used in order to make those systems to do something that they're not meant to do, or to gain access to data that we're not supposed to access. Of course, I don't have any ill intentions while doing this, so I work with companies and organizations, or worked to patch those things so that we can make our internet a little bit safer. And of course, there are many security, not only cybersecurity related issues that come with the problems that our digital life has brought, but also privacy related issues, and especially with the use of AI and machine learning. For instance, how, Catherine, you talked about the dehumanization aspect of everything. I think this has really put the privacy discussion and everything into a whole new level. And we are definitely on the edge of a really interesting change. And the problem here is that we're using computers to do all of this, and computers are not very smart. They're not actually smart at all. They're good at doing some things better than humans. For example, they're good at doing calculations, they're good at answering specific type of questions, but they are not good at understanding other people. They do not have feelings, they don't have hopes or dreams, which make them a really bad partner to solely rely on and just rely on in decision making. Of course, we can leverage AI, leverage technology for good, but in and of itself, it's not good or evil, but it's up to us how we decide to use this. But yeah, that's all.
Yes. Thank you. I am Rune Salman. I work as an Academy of Finland research fellow at Tampere University, where I'm also a lecturer in international security. So I've been interested in all kinds of ways in which digital images are reshaping security politics for a couple of decades almost already. And that's also how I come to this problem, because I tried to understand some of the images you showed. They were very, could have been illustrations that I had brought if I had brought any. I try to understand how autonomous weapons can understand the world that we live in. And a key component of that is computer vision systems. Right? And as with all other things that we call artificial intelligence, there's no kind of magic. We often talk about algorithms and artificial intelligence as if it's something that just happens. It isn't. It's carefully crafted. It takes millions of training data points and a lot of work by computer scientists to basically train the systems to recognize the right kind of patterns and identify them in unknown material. So I've been working with that a bit, trying to understand that from a kind of political scientist or security studies point of view. So if we go a little bit, in fact, I don't know how, are we supposed to do one reaction or maybe? I didn't really know. Is this an introduction or are we doing the whole?
Just go for it.
You keeping effect. I've been waiting here for ages. Okay, so I will do a very, very fast kind of crash course on how does computer vision work. Right? Basically, you have a lot of images that feature the things you would like to learn how to like the system to learn how to recognize. Right? They're called training images. They have to be gathered and they have to be labeled. And this involves humans labeling specific objects in those images. Now, the kind of most known and most used civilian database is called ImageNet. It's the one that is kind of behind a lot of, especially the object recognition progress that has happened over the last decade and a half or something like that. It has 14 million images, each of which have been labeled by at least 7 different labelers that get an enormously short amount of time to look for example, is there a car in this image? I have tried to do this myself, and so it's of course it's set up by computer scientists. So the time you have to react is reduced so much that you basically kind of start to use the brain as some kind of processor rather than actually think about what is in the images. Now these images, once they're labeled, they become what is called in the computer vision sciences ground truth. So that is a kind of definite account of what is in these images. And this is already, I think, problematic when we think from. I mean, this is very much kind of an opening up of what you said about the dehumanization, in a sense, that I'm presenting now. Right? So that ground truth is already assumed to be there beyond any doubt. Right? And even with the 14 million images in ImageNet, they only provide what they themselves call iconic views of the objects. That would mean like not where they are half occluded or twisted or seen maybe from a strange angle or something like this. But 14 million images can only provide sort of passport-like images of the objects they would like to. Now, of course, the military counterparts to these systems are mostly secret, right? So we don't know exactly what happens, but there was the case some years ago about Project Maven, which was a US defense project where Google was initially the provider. They attempted to label 150,000 images, up to 1 million images maybe. So basically a fraction of what these civilian systems is. So that already, it's an enormous, laborious and expensive task to do all this labeling. Right? Even when you have done it, you still have only kind of these sort of iconic views, and you have a very static image, picture of what is in an image. They can then, as you also said, they can perform extremely well in recognizing, for example, cars in images or something like this. Like standardized but very easy tasks are very good for computer vision systems to work with. But the problem becomes that when we see as human beings, right, there's no in that sense a ground truth. Right? Seeing is not something. It's not. I mean, it's a process that is generative. It's a process where new things happen. Right? There's all the time. If you go wander down the streets, there's a process of negotiating what is it to look fashionable or not. Right? And in all kinds of ways, human vision is not a categorization of objects out there. It's a social, a political process where we kind of make the world. Right? And that is impossible, I think, from this basic model of having ground truth and then having sophisticated algorithms working on that ground truth to keep up with the way in which the world basically changes when we look at it. And we change the world when we look at it as human beings. So I think I will hold it there and let that be a little bit of a deepening maybe or view behind how some of the things Catherine talked about. And then we can come back.
Okay, thank you. Good evening all. My name is Pekka Appelqvist. I come from the Ministry of Defense, where I serve as a research director. And before the deep dive into the subject, I need to make a short disclaimer statement that that what I say may not necessarily reflect the official position of Finland. However, I'm happy to discuss the rationale behind the thinking of the Defense Administration. But it goes without saying that Finland is a strong advocate of international humanitarian law and other rules and obligations that may apply. So it has to be noted that for many issues there isn't yet a stated position from Finland, as the work has been, as mentioned, carried out for 10 years already in the Geneva process, and it has been in the form of a group of governmental experts I have had the privilege to be part of that process since the beginning. But as we haven't yet been in a negotiation phase, and given that the technology is developing very rapidly, Finland hasn't taken an official positions to many of these questions yet. So that has to be understood as a background. But just a few remarks and observations of the thought. Thank you very much. Very insightful. And my first take is that this is definitely about autonomous decision making. This is not about some fictional killer robots. Of course, I understand that it's a very nice and an expression that raises feelings, but it's very misleading of the reality. And the second thing is that this scenery needs very multidisciplinary handling because there are these technological issues, there are international law and then the military realism. They're integrated. By the way, I'm a nerd as a background, so I'm a robotics science having done autonomous systems for 15 years. I was in academic career before turning to defense administration since 2009. Anyway, further note that this technology base behind it's completely dual use, and as with any weapon system, it can be, even though how legal or legally accepted it would be, I mean, not banned. So in any case, legal weapons can in any case be used in an illegal manner, and that's something that has to be noted. And then we come back to these that with what kind of limits and regulations we hypothetically introduce this kind of weapon systems. So they are very highly context dependent, and the kind of it's related to the weapons review process, that it's not just any weapon system, but then how it can be applied. But looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you so much. Is there anything you want to comment, Catherine? I see you writing, so I just wanted to ask if there's anything on your mind.
No, I thought those were all great summaries and really I think Rinda's comments about the way the computer vision works and the training on systems is really important and insightful. When we talk about dehumanization and the social and contextual processes that we as humans make that decisions can't make. And Laura's comments as well about vulnerabilities and hacking I think is very important, particularly when we think about as at the same time as we're seeing certain technologies become more sophisticated, it becomes easier to adopt those more maybe primitive type systems and adapt them for use in different ways, and how open will those systems to be to those kind of vulnerabilities. And then I think Pekka's comments as well about context dependency is really important, and I think that's why when we talk about and also about systems being dual use, what we're really talking about and what we want to see from Stop Killer Robots in terms of rules, and what we always try and tell people is that we're not talking about a specific kind of weapon system, we're talking about a functionality of a weapon system. And that's why for things like the rule for meaningful human control, those necessities or requirements for things to be predictable, understandable, and then to have those restrictions on geographic area and time frame of use are of course context dependent. Different systems would have different requirements, and all of those three building blocks would work together in different ways then, depending on the system in question and depending on the context in which that system will be used. So yeah, very aware of the context dependency there as well, and the fact that a lot of these technologies are dual use, so you're not trying to prohibit or create obligations for certain kinds of technology. What you're really trying to do is regulate the functionalities of systems.
Thank you. I suggest that we move on to a more open discussion. However, I have a few dedicated questions for each three of the new panelists. And also, my apologies, Laura, that I will speak from behind your back.
It's okay.
Not that functional, but the first question would be for you. However, I encourage all the panelists to engage organically, so if you'd like to make a comment or respond to something, just raise your hand, speak through, and I'll try to include you at some point. But, so, Laura, I'd love to know more about the risks related to cybersecurity and in the context of autonomous weapon systems. So, for example, is it possible to design a weapon system that is completely hack-proof?
Short answer, sorry. The short answer to is it possible to create anything with computers that is hack-proof is no. Because whenever we introduce computers, we introduce human-made programming, we introduce sensors, we introduce things where things can go wrong, where things can be manipulated. So it's with any sort of system, it's not possible to create 100% hack-proof systems. And to be honest, that's not like traditionally for cybersecurity, that's never the aim to make something like completely hack-proof. The aim is to make things so difficult to hack that it suits the purpose of the usage of that device or that computer. In this situation, when we're talking about technology, weapon technology, for instance, and very military-heavy use of it potentially, that technology typically, traditionally, has not been very open to for instance, outside review, which of course introduces the potential of having vulnerabilities. Because, for example, open source systems function well and they are open for discovery of vulnerabilities because it's open for everyone. It's easy for people to analyze it. But for these sort of autonomous systems, it's not guaranteed that there is a way for outside verification for vulnerabilities, or that the data that they're trained on is of good quality, because these are like different sorts of issues. Like there's the technical issue, like you have some sort of system that has embedded a computer in it. There could be sensors as well, and there are multiple issues that can happen with that, which is like having that computer in something. There's also network levels problems potentially. How is that device, computer potentially accessed, for instance? And then, for instance, in these machine learning or computer vision or image detection sort of capabilities, there's the issue of if the data that is being used to train these models is it of good quality? Has someone tampered with the data? Can someone tamper with the sensor itself and fool the sensor to do stuff that it shouldn't do? In cybersecurity, we call these techniques adversarial learning. So, for example, teaching the model to detect something as malicious while it shouldn't be detected as malicious, for instance. So there are multiple problems, and definitely when it comes to decision making, I think what we should have is a very high level of transparency on how these decisions are made, whether it's in weapons, whether it's in border control, or in any sort of manner.
Any comments on that, or shall we move on to the next question?
I guess I would just respond briefly to the need for transparency, and obviously, know that, say, in the AI Act and at the civilian level, right, there is going to be rules around transparency and the black box around algorithmic processing and requirements for oversight and so on. But obviously, that is generally, traditionally, in any area of military decision-making, much more difficult in that sphere. There's questions of national security and so on. So we would see the fact that You know, obviously we would love to see transparency around weapon systems and how target profiles are built and so on. But because of the fact that, you know, for legitimate national security concerns and so on that we know exist, that this is the reason that we need these new rules, because transparency and accountability are so much more difficult to obtain when it comes to like armed conflict situations and the kind of border control situations and so on that Laura has mentioned, like, and discussed really well there.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the part of kind of like the dilemma, I think, especially with autonomous systems such as this, is that, as I mentioned also before, is that these are national secrets. These technologies are not freely shipped outside of borders of specific countries. So yeah, definitely, I agree. It's a bit of a dilemma, but at the same time, it also comes down to privacy of us as citizens, potentially, not only in conflict areas, but especially when this decision making is used in not only border control, but by law enforcement, and in scenarios that Katarina, you had examples of in your presentation as well. So it is of course a dilemma, and that's one of the kind of why I think we are in this very interesting point in how privacy should look like in future.
Thank you, Laura. The next question would be for Pekka. It's quite of an open one, but could you provide us, or could you offer us with a military point of view on the topic at hand?
Well, what to start? I would say that the regulatory part, that it has to be realistic in that sense, that where the level of technology goes, it has to reflect the realism of what we are having in a society, and also these new technologies should be looked at in the context of existing weapon systems, and to figure out that how they compare. There are new types of threats and worries, also new positive avenues. So after all, there's of course at some point there's a kind of barrier for humanity that everybody kind of agrees that it's clear that this and this type of questions they are not for machines to decide. But then on the other hand, kind of ethically easier cases, kind of so to say, usually people don't necessarily kind of actively figure out that how far technology has already gone, and it's okay. Just as a stupid example, think about some anti-aircraft system having missiles, and it has been already for decades that the human operator, the soldier who's making or taking the meaningful decision to launch the missiles against an airplane. So if you think about this a bit more philosophically, it has been already for decades that the operator has had no clue what he's actually shooting down while launching the missile, the anti-aircraft missile. What has been done, he or she has been relying on the information what the radar systems and other sensors give, And now the kind of philosophical question is that while the system is blinking and time is running out, and to survive, whether you trust the system or not, because it's a question of your life, basically. So this is a stupid kind of play example, but it kind of reveals the fact where we are or have been for tens of years already. And so in that case, it's about trust. And or think about any other modern system, what uses, for example, image processing or something else. It's about trust. It's tested, and we know, of course, there are certain error rates, but it's accepted. I'm not saying that there's anything positive, but as we know, big wars are going on at the moment. So this discussion should be kind of also handled in that sense, and also that kind of people's attitudes and kind of how they position themselves with computers or devices. It also changes, maybe not that rapidly that the AI is developing, but sure, how we understand and what role and what meaning we give to technology, it obviously varies. I mean, my kids are taking completely different acceptions than myself. And, well, just again, this is more of a philosophical thing, but just to know that we should put this into context and also kind of think about that. What is the solution today? What these maybe hypothetical novel type of weapon systems, what they bring to the table, different types of critical problems, for sure, but also possibilities for some positive if they can solve. Maybe I'll leave it.
Thank you, Pekka. You made great use of such an open question. Other panelists, do you have anything to add or comment or respond?
Maybe, I mean, I think you are talking about the human in the loop kind of question, right? And I think it's an area where it's really not only in weapon systems, but also in all the other systems that are increasingly relying on data to make decisions about us. It's really interesting, how do we kind of develop those, or thinking about those positions that a human operates in relation to technology. There was a case a couple of years ago after the first victim of the self-driving car in the US, in Arizona, where Uber, which was the operator of the self-driving car, made it to blame the so-called safety driver who was sitting in the car and supposedly having control over it when the car ran over a pedestrian that crossed the road in an unexpected place. And I think it somehow it provides a kind of dystopian future of the position of the human here, because it's basically a self-driving car, and then there's a human sitting in a driver's seat, I guess, for 10,000 hours. I don't know how long it takes before the system fails, right? And then at some point it fails, and you have half a second to correct the error. So there's also something about what can we expect from ourselves, or from the positions we put humans to in relation to technology. I'm sure that's also something that is I think maybe the armed forces have a better way to think about and handle than Uber did, at least in this case. So, but if you can say more about those human in the loop questions, I would be very interested.
Yeah, So at first I would say that there's of course the kind of ethical evaluation in the background must be that what is basically where are the red lines at all in the system or in the various cases, but then it's basically I would say that if we just as a play example, if we diminish the task what we assign for the system, if we diminish the task to a very small one, so I'm sure we are all fine that the system will cope with it. But then while it becomes more and more complex, the uncertainties will expand. And so I would simply put that given that we are now talking about some hypothetical system deployed in place, I would say that the cognitive skills of the machine or the system should be on par with the tasking. That's kind of the thing that how much reach you can give for the system. It's like a dog. It's like a trained dog while you are walking with the dog out and if it's behaving nicely and you trust it, you can have long leash with it. But if it's very angry and biting anyone near you, you certainly won't allow it to operate or walk out there. So in that sense, and because we know that there are also again hypothetically, but while the need to have scenarios that might do something also in an out of the loop way. So it's then kind of question of lawfare. You are all familiar with the notion that how we that we won't tie our hands, but it doesn't mean that systems should be introduced once we are not comfortable with them. So it's very important to so again it's your trust. Sorry for the long answer. Difficult one.
So not sure if you hear me. Yeah, you already thought. First of all, thank you both of you, and Runa, maybe you could continue as you already started. We would love to know more about computer vision technology, and especially how do autonomous weapon systems utilize vision technology, and what are the risks? Can you say, for example, algorithmic biases? Are those an issue?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's very hard to answer, but of course, most weapon systems are developed in a sort of secret fashion, so that makes it difficult to open up and, as we talked about before, verify how things are going on and what are the error margins that are accepted and so on and so forth. But we are also in this discussed point in time that I think you alluded to before, where we have a lot of dual-use technologies, and for the past decade at least, it has mostly been the civilian technologies that have, at least as far as we know, been leading the AI race compared to military technologies, right? That's also one of the things I tried to say with the magnitude, the difference of how big training databases were the military, US military envisioning, and what are the civilian counterparts. Right? So we are at a kind of technological moment where I think it has often been so that military technologies have been, after some time, spreading in civilian use, but we are very much in the kind of reverse moment now. So that at least in that way we can know a little bit about how the technologies like computer vision technologies operate, and hypothesize that they will be operating a little bit in the same way in a kind of military context. And I think, of course, that there has been a lot of debate about algorithmic bias. Mostly, that debate has been, and kind of for good reasons, but it has been very much about race and gender, because those are fundamental questions that we know how to relate to politically. But for the algorithmic systems out there, they have no clue what is race or gender. And the bias in this sense are not different from biases in other sense. It's just that they are biases where, for example, you can say, okay, a lot of the early face recognition systems, they were very bad at recognizing people with darker skin. They are also slightly worse at recognizing women than recognizing men, right? So then we can understand, okay, this is a problem. But actually, I think underneath those kind of surface problems that we can identify because we think in terms of, or we know how to think in terms of gender and race already, we know the problems that come with it. There's an unlimited amount of weird categories that we don't have because they don't make sense to us as humans in the same way, right? They're not social categories, but where there are similar inaccuracies like biases that you could find if you would know how to search for them. I also think, though, that this is, in the end, mostly a problem when systems are put into use, right? Because if every policeman who operates a face recognition system in the public knows exactly how good is it at recognizing people with darker skin, how good is it at recognizing Roma people, how good is it at recognizing women, how good is it at recognizing older persons versus younger persons. If all the policemen knew exactly how it would operate, then in a sense, it would not be, the problem would not be eliminated, but it would be a lot better. But that is, I think that was also some of the components you actually talked about in your presentation, that are some of the requirements that ICRC are presenting, right?
Yeah, so just briefly I'll respond there. And yeah, so the ICRC have said that they think there should be prohibition on systems that are designed to target humans. And we agree, we think that there should be a prohibition on systems that use sensor information related to things like age, race, gender, so on, in these systems. And then also just to kind of respond to your comments as well on things like biases in race and gender. So, we saw from some of the examples that I gave in the use of automated decision making in the civilian context, that you could see from the examples on, right, those are pretty representative of like the broader set of examples where we see these race and gender biases and class biases as well a lot of the time in systems. So predictive policing systems are generally used in lower income communities in numerous countries, and a lot of the time those lower income communities are of course minority communities. So we have like an intersecting issue of biases here. But also to say that all data is socially situated. There is, no such thing as like a perfect, completely unbiased data set. And like Runa's just said, there's all these other categories that we could have as well, or that we could, a system could create that we don't think about because they might make sense to us socially. And then also, of course, different societies have different ways of categorizing people and different ways of socially situating the data that we take in every day. So it's not, it's not a question of, if we could eliminate all biases, then we should use these systems, or these systems will be okay to use. There's still fundamental moral and ethical questions about using these systems to process and target humans. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, if I can come back a little bit. So that I absolutely agree. Of course, there are still questions, even if you would know all the biases that are in the system. But I think it's also a problem that we are now, just with my research group, almost completed a report on the use of computer vision technologies in Finnish public order institutions, that is the police and the border force. And there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, in a sense of the systems, or that these bias questions can be solved at the technology acquisition point. So that basically an officer can just go out and use it and not think about all those questions I mentioned before. And I think it's really vital for our use of these systems kind of across society that we become a little bit more literate in thinking that, it's not just a hammer, no matter how you use it. It's a system that is actually quite difficult, quite different in relation to some subgroups of a population to other subgroups. So it's something that needs to be kind of implemented at the kind of point of contact between the citizens and authorities. Even, of course, that there will still be a lot of questions that you can ask from algorithmic decision-making systems.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to remind that warfare is not personal business. That this police work and kind of the facial recognition issues. So it's not mainly in this context. It's not a military problem in that sense. But of course, as a wider question, that's of course one thing. But also to me, as having worked with these, I see so many other sources of error and that always hearing that this data bias is kind of raised. So it kind of to me it's a bias itself. That why it's just always the data bias, because there are so many other things that can go wrong also.
Yeah, for the data bias, it's also a matter of how kind of like the data bias is because of the data that exists and data that can be collected and then taught. Now I'm talking about specifically AI systems or vision systems or like any sort of machine learning systems. So then it becomes also a question of how this data is obtained. So where does this data come from? And this goes for commercial use, this goes for ChatGPT and everything. Like, of course, there's the copyright issues, but there's also the matter of privacy issues. So what kind of data is obtained from us and then used to teach algorithms, not algorithms, but machine learning and AI that can then do this, do these decisions.
If there are no additional comments, I would want to. I'm just going to throw the question out there, and whoever wants to take the turn and answer first can do it. My question for you would be: can AI be regulated? So, can we, for example, reach a treaty to ban killer robots before it's too late? Is it possible? Who wants to start?
I'll just go in the first instance. Quickly, the answer is yes and yes. AI can be regulated. Again, it's like Ruth said earlier that AI isn't magic. It has to be like brought into the world, and humans are significantly involved in the creation of these systems, and so it can be regulated. Can we have a legal instrument on autonomy in weapon systems? The answer is yes. The majority of states in discussions have indicated that they want negotiations to begin. That's the majority of states at the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in Geneva, where talks have been ongoing for about 10 years. The majority of those states have said they want negotiations on an instrument. Now, it's up to states at the end of the day to make those negotiations happen and to decide what is in that instrument. But, absolutely, we believe that an instrument can happen. The ICRC believes that an instrument can happen. The UN Secretary General believes that an instrument can happen. And I think I mentioned in presentation earlier, that he has called for states to conclude negotiations by 2026. So yeah, my answer is yes and yes, and I'll stop there and other people can jump in.
Yeah, I believe that it can be regulated. It's for humans. Why cannot be regulated? And of course we should also, but we should do it in a wise way. And that's the difficulty. That's why I believe that in Geneva it has been quite many years where lost that part of the people were just talking about robots and others were talking about autonomous decision making, and then it kind of the convergence have been kind of we see building of that. Of course, and there are some states that don't follow this, but I see definitely merit that all are on board, because that has also been the backbone for the Finnish position on any arms control issue. That kind of regulations and agreements that do have real impact, they matter. Others don't. So it has been kind of the rationale there. But definitely, but because of the very complex nature of AI and fast developing too, so it has of course be the kind of principles and so I mean that as an arms control issue, it is completely different than what the previous ones have been. You have been able to categorize and define somehow the parts that you want to ban or regulate. But this is amoeba. This is very difficult to tackle, and that's why the regulations has to be on a higher level principles, and it's very difficult because warfare in general is also very diverse. It happens in all domains and in cyber domain as well, and even space, some say. That it's definitely difficult in that sense, and that's why it's takes time. But I also feel that the momentum is kind of getting. It will take time, and now we come to the interesting, as you formulated the question, that before it's too late. What do you mean by that?
Well, my turn on, or my take on this is that us humans tend to ban certain weapon systems after some kind of massive tragedy has already happened. Or us humans tend to, we are a bit slow in making decisions that maybe would be good for humanity. So there comes the formulation.
Okay. Yeah, got the point. But then we also have to note that there are bad guys who don't kind of agree with the decisions with the others.
I think that's a great lead into what I was going to say. Is that I think it's possible to have a regulation of automatic decision making in weapon systems, but it's still international law, so it's probably unlikely that everybody will agree. It's unlikely that everybody will comply. And it also doesn't really function as a national law system. So there's little one can do except say, hey, this is prohibited, and I know that you know it. But I think that is also a real impact if it's not, even if it's not a kind of a complete ban in some way. But I mean, I think there's there's real value in directing technology to do the things that we wanted it to do, and making those kind of. I mean, we've been talking about a lot of quite difficult concepts here, right? So doing that whole development that we also need to do. It's not only AI that develops, it's also our thinking about how do we live in the world with these kind of technologies. So I think there's also a real impact in having those discussions and formulating them. And then my take would be that even if there are some actors that think otherwise and will not join, I think it will be of benefit to humanity to have the discussions and try to come up with the rules that we think we should follow in our interaction with these kinds of technologies.
I do think that regulation is important in many matters, but I do echo what also Pekka said on the matter of not everyone will play by the rules, even if we agree on something within specific countries, within specific regions, it does not mean that everyone will do the same, unfortunately. With that being said, I'm not, of course, expert on the lawmaking and regulations around weapons, but when it comes to, because computers and AI, they are so significant part of this modern world, even like modern warfare, things that take place on the internet and the things that, for example, at the start of the war in Ukraine, the attacks we started to see, and even before that, to be honest, in Ukraine that happened in cyberspace, those were not really leveraging AI, but we have already seen what pre-AI technology, internet can do. It can rig elections, it can really shake our democracies. And with AI, of course, the information warfare and the way that it can be employed, sorry, this is a little bit off topic, but a little bit to the point, how it can be leveraged for these purposes is, of course, another matter. And when it comes to regulation, I think EU has been quite successful in some privacy-related regulations, and this has something to do with AI, especially commercial use of AI, which then can turn to military use, as Rhoda, you said. This kind of has the opposite effect these days. For instance, GDPR, so general data regulation practices. So how people's data who live in EU can be used in other countries, and this has had effects, of course, in companies that operate in EU region. And this of course is a little bit different from weaponry and autonomous decision making there. But I think the data collection and privacy, these are really central topics when it comes to AI, because it's all about data, to be honest. It's all about teaching these computers to detect something based on data that they have. And this data has to originate from somewhere. It comes from open sources, it comes from public sources. Some of the examples that you, Catherine, showed, I forgot the name of the company, but they essentially use people's images from social media to create technology that was used to then to detect people when they enter Macy's, like a department store, for instance. So these sort of things are, of course, things that can be regulated, at least regionally, and hopefully those effects will kind of propagate outside of EU as well.
Thank you for all your answers. Now we've reached the point that it's time to open the floor for the audience questions. So if any of you has any queries or thoughts you'd like to share with our panelists, or maybe you have a question you want to dedicate to a certain person here, then just please raise your hand and we'll... Do we get the microphone, or should we just shout out loud?
Being loud.
Yeah. Okay. So being loud is the option here. So who would want to go first? There we have.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I would have a comment which may take even several minutes. So if somebody has questions, perhaps take those first.
But
the comment I would like to to serve sometime.
So now we have reserve.
I'll
Comments.
serve it now. I think one should make a difference between civilian uses for police and military uses. And military systems, the hope to get them forbidden, international, is, I think, in vain. Of course, you will get agreement for forbidding from nations who have neither the money nor the technology to develop these systems themselves. But those who have systems are on the way to develop them in competition with, for example, the USA. You will not get the agreement because nobody wants to be delivered to the whims of somebody who is technologically far superior. And to give the example of the USA, since decades, the US Navy has an Aegis system, which is on ships and claimed to be able to track 200 objects in the air simultaneously, and at the same time to organize 20 different intercepts. They have, as I said, since several decades. First they needed a cruiser to carry the system. Now it is made with the standard equipment of the destroyers of the US Army. The job is a job which even teams of humans cannot do. Tracking 200 different objects at the same time, humans can't. So the USA will never give up the system, especially as it's established since decades. And countries who try to keep up with the USA militarily, China especially, Russia perhaps, India perhaps, Israel, that will not either agree to forbid them. And eager NATO members will not either agree as long as the USA doesn't agree, so it will never happen. That's the same situation as the nuclear weapons. About civilian uses, recognizing people, identifying people. I have been several times in the position to sit at the same table with somebody whom I thought I knew from earlier. That I know was a different person. So same face, same outlook, same voice, but different person. The same can easily happen to a computer, so one can perhaps get an international agreement that consequences of identifying somebody have to be confirmed by humans. But if one thinks one has a very dangerous criminal behind the door, we may soon have the robots whom one can send in instead of policemen. In a factory which is supposed to assemble human-like robots by the dozen and hundreds is now under construction. And somehow to shoot a robot, you can easily protect it. So difference between military and civilian systems and international agreement, perhaps possible for civilian systems, for military system, forget it.
Do any of the panelists have any response to the comment?
Yeah, I'll just respond briefly on the military side. So the US Aegis system and then the UK's phalanx system and systems like that wouldn't be prohibited under these rules or under this instrument. So those we know that autonomy has existed to certain degrees in weapon systems for decades, as Pekka mentioned earlier as well. They wouldn't be prohibited under this kind of instrument either. I'm going to keep it brief. I know other people will probably have questions and comments to make too. And then just in terms of NATO members as well, a number of NATO members have already said that they would like to begin negotiations on legal rules. And these are, that's the general direction of travel from states as well. And numerous NATO members NATO itself has already said that it will be making AI guidelines, and then it will be up to member states of NATO themselves to decide their positions on actual creating a legally binding instrument. And of course, not every state is going to agree. Of course, not every state is going to join a treaty. That's the reality of international law and the reality of the international order or disorder, whatever that we live in. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And I guess I'll hand over in case anyone else wants to make a statement or anything or respond, or if there's another question.
Well, just an overall observation that many organizations and companies and other entities are setting up their responsible AI rules. So obviously it has been kind of understood that if this is not regulated, somehow we encounter very odd and harmful situations. That's quite clear. But again, then to as you said that they was it you that they come too slowly. Yeah, might be, but usually it's just a human nature that, and it's because this is also these advances are so rapid, like what has been happening just in recent years, that also I'm not sure that if the kind of good practices were kind of set up 5 years ago, have they necessarily kind of been able to kind of tackle those issues that the novel developments came. That I mean that there's a kind of it's inherent that the regulations will come kind of afterwards, because it's very difficult to ban computers before. Kind of that's why it's very difficult to see that. But sure, while you are thinking this on a higher level principles, so then by finding out that what is the red line for humans, where humans should be applied, and when we allow machines to do something, I guess on that level it would be possible.
Any additional questions from the audience? Yeah, go for it.
What's in your opinion to kind of the right level to put these limitations, so regulate? We have been talking, or you have been talking about UN and then EU and also NATO, Finland. How do you see that different levels of decision making or organizations should?
So, well, what we would be calling for would be an international legal treaty. So that could be either through a UN process, like the CCW, outside the CCW, a General Assembly treaty, or an outside process, as has happened with previous disarmament process. But that would then become an instrument of international humanitarian law. It will be up to the EU to decide on if it wanted its own process there. I mean, the EU generally doesn't take a common position or regulation for defence matters. There's the European Convention on Human Rights, but that's separate. Not, the EU itself takes common positions on certain things. So like the AI Act, for example, is more about commercial kind of regulation and those kind of systems that we face every day, but they don't take a common position on defence and security matters. It's up generally to the states themselves to decide that. So at the regulation level for autonomous weapon systems, that would be in the kind of forum that it's going on now, so an international legal instrument that would either be a standalone process or through a UN body.
Any additional questions from the audience? Go for it.
Just one small comment. I graduated 1 year ago from Finnish University of Applied Sciences, and I was studying artificial intelligence, and they said one of the best examples is killer robots without any ethics or moral. They just mention it, and you know, when you go to work, that's something that you could do or you should do. And when I mentioned that I disagree, that it's about killing and there are risks, and they got kind of angry. Teachers were from some major IT companies usually are. And I wonder if this is the case in all the universities of the world who teach artificial intelligence, that this is just something that you then do when you graduate and you go to work. And I got quite shocked myself.
Any responses?
Maybe I can start with that from the university world. I have been trying for a long time to, as a political scientist or international relations scholar, talk to computer vision developers. And I don't think that they want to go and build killer robots, but I do think that the kind of mindset, in a sense, is problem solving, right? So there's an engineering problem, and then you have to be smart to solve it, right? So this kind, I think it's coming. Definitely, the kind of awareness of the enormously large-scale unintended consequences that you might have in developing artificial intelligence. I think especially the havoc that has been wreaked on our public debate by social media systems over the last decade or something like this has made it clear also to far into the computer sciences that computing problems are not only computing problems, they are also in some cases at least large-scale social problems, and you need to kind of think those things, as part of developing things. Not only what is possible to develop, who can do it fastest, most efficient, and so on. That are kind of the traditional, I think, computer sciences approaches to things. But I think that, there's been multiple rounds of technological scientists endorsing different kind of open letters and so on, right, about killer robots. So I think there's a very large awareness in the technological sciences that these problems are problems we do not want to have. And I think there's also been a large drive to say, like, we want to be, similar to the Google employee walkout that I talked about in the opening, that technology developers want to be able to develop technology, and since it's often civilian use that leads military use, they want to be able to develop technology and be certain that they are not contributing to military use without being asked in advance, at least. So I think, I don't know who you found, but I think that they are anomalies, definitely, I think. And if I can say that to a little bit to the first question also, because it very much touches on the same, that I don't think that any military would be able to develop any kind of those kind of functions that you talked about, Catherine, that should be regulated without drawing on civilian technology. I simply don't think so. So in that sense, you cannot as neatly separate military and civilian. And the regulation that then goes into civilian development also has an impact, even if it's not like a prohibition straightforward, but it has an impact about the way technology goes, and also the kind of military uses then that it can be tweaked to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Rune hits a point here that this is completely dual use, and I also underline that, and I would imagine or forecast that the kind of quest for ethical AI in sense luomu AI, that while people get more and more kind of interested and kind of see things that are that are not unwanted. So I would imagine that these kind of ethical requests and specifications will probably have a big role in the future. Yes.
Looking at the time, if there's a really short question in the audience, we still have just a few minutes. Throw it up.
Yeah, thank you. This question is for Pekka and also for Catherine. So, on the slideshow that was presented, it was shown that Finland has not yet taken a position on some of the international initiatives being promoted by Stop Killer Robots and, of course, within the UN and other NGOs worldwide. Yet there are many countries on there which have taken positions. And one of the reasons you provided that Finland hasn't yet taken a position is because the technology is rapidly changing. Every country is impacted by the same technological changes, right? So what Canada has decided on, for example, is the same information that Finland has access to, for example, machine learning and vision image recognition. So when will Finland take a position, and which direction is it leaning, and why has it not yet taken a position?
Well, of course, I cannot give any straight answer to this, and of course, these arms control issues are under the responsibility of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but sure we are closely cooperating the defense administration with them. But just as an answer to your question, I would say that different countries make different assumptions, and it obviously reflects the operational environment where states and countries are in the match. So that's maybe one part of the answer.
I guess I can't speak for Finland or Finnish politicians or diplomats or anything either, but I would just note that yes, Finland has not decided where they fall on the question of a legal instrument. They have said that they see a need for prohibitions and obligations of some kind, but they haven't decided what form, or it hasn't decided what form it would like those to take specifically yet. But it has also acknowledged the need for human control and the challenges raised by the systems too. So yeah, it's currently just a ... there with some other countries. Yeah.
Is there anything you want to add, Laura or Rune?
No, I think that's quite concrete.
Just going to take the microphone.
If I just want to address that absolutely we are on pro of the rule-based system, including weapons and arms control as well, and all the obligations we naturally take very seriously.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, there's no time for additional questions, but we still have about, let's say, 30 seconds for each panelist. If you have any concluding remarks, comments, or something you want to say before we finish, I will give you the stage. And I suggest that once again we go in that robin round format. So we begin with Laura, then we move on to Rune, then and last Catherine.
So 30 seconds, that's a short
30
one.
seconds.
But,
I'm going to put up the time.
Yeah. It's I want to rephrase something that I think, Rune, you kind of concluded very nicely, is that civilian technology, especially when it comes to computers, maybe in the past when computers were very exclusive, like it was a very exclusive club of people who had access to computers, had access to technologies around networking and things like this, but it has become more commercial, which has created this environment where some of the innovations that can be repurposed for military use are definitely taking place in commercial organizations. For example, computer like OCR or like vision image detection type of capabilities. Primarily, that could be used only for civilian use, but repurposing that is really, like, the technology is there. It's potentially even open source technology that could be repurposed. With that being said, going back to the privacy aspect, and I think this is really central, that the data that goes into teaching these systems, it is one of the things that is, I think, somewhat under-addressed. And I think there's more talk now with the rise of ChatGPT, but this is not only ChatGPT issue, this has been an issue before even. So how to make sure that this data is actually handled properly, it's not violating our individual human rights, and how can this be leveraged for good, and so that it's not, these decisions are not made by machines who have very unfair assumptions of us as humans.
Great, then I will continue straight from there, because it reminds me of something that I find very interesting, which is exactly the way in which we are implicated as civilians in technology development. Right? Some of the data sets that are used to train following people from camera to camera in a multi-camera operation, and to learn things like gait recognition, like how do people walk, identifying people by that. They come out of US college data sets from the 90s, right? And they're now used probably against Uyghur minorities in China. Right? So I think there's another way to also say that we need also to think about, can we have more control over the data that is produced by us? Of course, maybe these people, they acknowledge, agreed to be in a data set for training the local computer department in Connolly University in 1992, but they didn't agree to all that subsequent use that they're being put to. Right? So there's also something about, can we have rights to the data that is produced about us, to kind of have some kind of limitations to what it can be used for. I think that's another area where AI development can be influenced for good.
Yeah, thank you. Just that these, so to say, killer robots that just like to kind of calm down that actually the thing that militaries are the most worried is that they would somehow lose the command chain, because the command chain that things keep in order, that's in the essence of armies, and thereby having something that is loose out there and you don't have control to it. It's a very strange idea. It sounds terrorism or something else, and that's why this should be seen. And the final thing that I think that we should be more worried of kind of underdeveloped AI that could be tried to apply in a too ambitious way. So that personally, I'm not worried about developed AI that I and the organizations can trust, and it's AI systems by nature are so complex that you cannot kind of mathematically prove that they are working. It's like the everyday technology what we have in use that they develop incrementally, and once we start trusting them, then they kind of will get accepted, but of course in the context of weapon systems, somewhere lies the kind of human barrier, and it should of course be recognized and respected.
So similarly to Runa and Pekka, I'll just jump right into there and take up the human barrier point. So we see that there should be a strong red line against allowing systems to process humans in particular as objects, and to have systems being able to initiate the action to take human life without an immediate human command or human involvement. And again, to hark back to what Runa said about AI and automated decision making isn't something that just happens, and it's not magic. There are political and socio-political choices made by the people and companies who decide to create systems and who decide the way in which systems are used and what they're going to be used for, who they're going to be used against, where they're going to be used. And it's really important that all of us think about those choices, not just in the context of the technology that we might be slightly uncomfortable with using ourselves every day, even though we all have like facial recognition on our phones and everything now, and we don't really think about it, but to think about it in the wider context, what we want our societies to look like, what we want our world to look like, what we want to use this technology for, and whether we are happy for us to activate machines that can take human life without a human on the other end.